They called him the hangman of Harris County, Judge Lawrence Thorne. He didn't just sentence people, he destroyed them. And today, he had his sights locked on Martin Hayes, a man whose only crime was driving a luxury car while black. Thorne thought this was just another routine destruction of a life, another statistic to feed his ego and his private prison kickbacks. He smirked as he raised his gavel, ready to deliver the final blow. But Judge Thorne made one fatal miscalculation. He didn't notice the two quiet figures in the back row taking notes. He didn't know that the man he was about to crush was the bait for a trap 5 years in the making. The gavel is about to fall, but not on Martin. Watch until the end to see the most satisfying courtroom takedown in history. The sun was just beginning to dip below the skyline of Austin, Texas, casting a burnt orange glow across the hood of the pristine 22 Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Inside, Martin Hayes adjusted the rearview mirror, checking his tie. It was a Windsor knot, perfectly symmetrical, resting against a crisp white collar. Martin wasn't a man who took things for granted. At 34, he was the youngest regional director for Apex Logistics, a supply chain firm that moved half the freight in the Southwest. He had clawed his way up from a warehouse packer to the boardroom, fueled by sleepless nights and an unshakable promise he made to his mother before she passed. I will build something no one can take away. Tonight was the celebration. He had just closed the deal with the city for a new distribution hub. It meant 300 new jobs for his old neighborhood. It meant security. It meant he had finally arrived. He signaled to turn onto 5th Street, humming along to a little Sam Cooke, playing softly through the Burmester speakers. The light turned yellow. Martin eased onto the brakes, coming to a smooth, complete stop well behind the white line. That was when the lights flashed, blue and red, distinct and blinding, filling the cabin of his car. Martin felt that familiar cold drop in his stomach, the biological reaction that every black man in America learns before he learns long division. He turned down the music. He placed his hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He took a deep breath. You've done nothing wrong, Martin. Just a tail light. Maybe a mistake. He watched in the side mirror as the officer approached. The uniform was tight, the walk aggressive. Officer Derek Cole. The name tag would later be burned into Martin's memory, but for now he was just a silhouette with a hand resting too close to his holster. Cole tapped the glass with his baton. Hard. Martin lowered the window. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? License and registration. Now. Cole didn't look at Martin. He was scanning the interior of the car, his eyes darting like a predator looking for weakness. It's in the glove box. I'm going to reach for it now, Martin said, his voice steady, practiced. Whose car is this? Cole snapped. It's mine, officer. Yours? Cole let out a short, dry laugh. This is a $140,000 vehicle. You expect me to believe a guy like you owns a ride like this? A guy like me? Martin paused, handing over the registration. I'm not sure what you mean. My name is on the title, right there. Officer Cole snatched the papers. He didn't read them. He crumpled them slightly in his fist. Step out of the vehicle. Officer, for what reason? I haven't committed a traffic violation. I smell narcotics, Cole lied. The lie was so casual, so rehearsed, it hung in the air like exhaust fumes. That is impossible, Martin said, his heart rate spiking. I don't smoke and I don't drink. There are no drugs in this car. Step out, or I will drag you out. Cole's hand unsnapped the retention strap of his holster. Martin calculated the odds. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered. Any sudden movement would be interpreted as aggression. He slowly unbuckled, opened the door, and stepped onto the pavement. Turn around, hands on the hood. As Martin complied, The hot metal of the engine burning his palms, he saw a second cruiser pull up. 2 more officers jumped out. They weren't there to de-escalate. They were there to reinforce the narrative. "What do we have, Cole?" the second officer asked. "Suspect is belligerent. Possible stolen vehicle. Smells like a dispensary in there." "That is a lie," Martin shouted, his composure cracking. "Check the registration. Call my office. I'm a director at Apex Logistics." "Stop resisting," Cole yelled. He swept Martin's legs. The world tilted. Martin hit the asphalt hard, his cheek scraping against the grit. A knee drove into his back, forcing the air from his lungs. The click of handcuffs was the loudest sound on the street. "You're making a mistake," Martin wheezed, dust in his mouth. "I have rights." "You have the right to shut up," Cole whispered in his ear, leaning down close. "And down at the precinct? You're going to learn that in this town, your rights end where my badge begins." They tossed him into the back of the cruiser like a bag of garbage. As they drove away, Martin watched through the wire mesh as a tow truck backed up to his Mercedes. He wasn't thinking about the car. He was thinking about the project, the meeting tomorrow morning, the reputation he had spent 15 years building. He didn't know yet that Officer Cole was just the doorman. He was about to enter the house of a monster. The holding cell smelled of bleach and despair. Martin had been processed, fingerprinted, and stripped of his suit jacket and tie. He sat on a cold metal bench, surrounded by men who looked defeated. Some were sleeping, others were pacing. Martin used his one phone call to reach the only lawyer he trusted, Elena Rosales. She was a pit bull in a skirt suit, a woman who had fought the system for 20 years. But when she arrived at the precinct 3 hours later, her face was pale. "Martin," she said, sitting on the other side of the plexiglass. "I saw the docket. Get me out of here, Elena. This is insanity. That cop, Cole, he planted the narrative. They didn't find anything in the car because there was nothing to find." Elena looked down at her file, her fingers trembling slightly. "They found a baggie, Martin, under the passenger seat. 5 grams of cocaine." Martin felt the blood drain from his face. "That's a lie. He planted it. You know he planted it." "I believe you," Elena said, her voice intense. "But that's not the worst part. The worst part is the judge assigned to your arraignment." "Who is it?" "Judge Lawrence Thorne." The name landed like a physical blow. Even corporate guys like Martin knew the name. In the legal circles of Texas, Thorne was a mythic figure of cruelty. They called him the Hangman, because once you stepped into his courtroom, your life was effectively over. He had the highest conviction rate in the state and the harshest sentencing record for minority defendants in the country. "Thorne?" Martin whispered. "I thought he handled high-level felonies. Why is he taking a possession and resisting arrest case?" "He requested it," Elena said darkly. "He specifically pulled your file." "Martin, Thorne runs his courtroom like a fiefdom. He doesn't care about evidence. He cares about making examples. And he's up for re-election. A wealthy black executive caught with drugs? You're his campaign poster." The next morning, Martin was led into courtroom 4B in shackles. The room was freezing. The wood paneling was dark, absorbing the light. The gallery was packed, mostly family members of other defendants, weeping softly or praying. But in the front row, behind the prosecutor's table, sat Officer Derek Cole, looking smug, chewing gum. And high above them all, on a mahogany bench that looked more like a throne, sat Judge Lawrence Thorne. Thorne was a massive man, pale and doughy, with thinning grey hair slicked back against his skull. His eyes were small, watery, and devoid of humanity. He didn't look at files, he looked at people. He scrutinized them like insects he was deciding whether to crush or pin. Case number 4922B, the bailiff announced. State of Texas versus Martin Hayes. Elena stood up. Your Honor, Elena Rosales for the defense. We are requesting bail be set at— Sit down, Ms. Rosales, Thorne boomed. His voice was a deep, gravelly rasp. I haven't heard the charges. Your Honor, the charges are possession of a controlled substance and resisting arrest. The prosecutor, a weaselly man named Vance, who acted as Thorne's lapdog, recited. The defendant was belligerent and assaulted Officer Cole during the traffic stop. Assaulted? Martin blurted out. I never touched him. Bang! The gavel strike was like a gunshot. Another outburst from the defendant. And I will have you gagged, Thorne sneered. He leaned over the bench, staring directly at Martin. You think because you wear a fancy suit you're above the law, boy? The word hung in the air. Boy. It was a deliberate, calculated slur. Your Honor, Elena interjected, her voice sharp. My client is a respected executive with no prior record. The use of such language is prejudicial and— Overruled, Thorne barked. I call them like I see them. This man drives a car worth more than my bailiff makes in 5 years. You expect me to believe he earned that honestly? We know how people like him get money in this city. A murmur went through the court. This was blatant. It wasn't just bias, it was open hostility. Bail is denied, Thorne said, shuffling the papers. Denied, Elena gasped. For a first-time possession charge. That is unconstitutional. The guidelines suggest— I am the guidelines in this courtroom, Thorne roared, his face turning a blotchy red. This man is a flight risk. He has resources. He is a danger to the community. He stays in county until trial. Trial is set for, let's see, 2 days from now. 2 days? Elena shouted. I need time to prepare. I need discovery. We haven't even seen the dashcam footage. Motion for continuance denied, Thorne said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. If he's innocent, surely you can prove it quickly. Get him out of my sight. As the bailiffs grabbed Martin by the arms, he looked back at the judge. Thorne was already looking away, checking his watch, bored. But as Martin was dragged toward the side door, he locked eyes with 2 people sitting in the very back row of the gallery. They didn't look like the usual crowd. A woman in a navy blazer and a man with a buzz cut. They weren't crying. They weren't praying. The woman, Agent Sarah Miller, adjusted her glasses and wrote something in a small notebook. The man, Agent David Ross, tapped an earpiece. Martin didn't know who they were, but he saw the look in the woman's eyes. It wasn't pity. It was anger. And it wasn't directed at him. It was directed at the judge. As the heavy door slammed shut, separating Martin from his freedom, the nightmare truly began. But unbeknownst to Thorne, the hunter was being hunted. 48 hours is not enough time to prepare a defense for a jaywalking ticket, let alone a felony drug case that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in Texas. Elena Rosales knew this. Judge Thorne knew this. It was the point. Elena's office was a war zone of crumpled coffee cups and legal pads. It was 3:00 a.m. on the morning of the trial. She hadn't slept. They're stonewalling us on everything, Martin, Elena said, holding her phone to her ear with her shoulder as she frantically typed on her laptop. She was speaking to Martin, who was using his allotted daily call from the county jail. His voice sounded hollow, unrecognizable from the confident executive of 2 days ago. Have you seen the dashcam footage, Elena? That's all we need. It will show I never resisted. It will show Cole was aggressing from second one. Elena stopped typing. The silence on the line stretched. Elena? Vance, the prosecutor, just sent over the discovery file an hour ago, Elena said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. There's a memo regarding Officer Cole's cruiser video system. And? It malfunctioned. According to the police report, The entire system crashed 30 seconds before he pulled you over. It didn't record a single frame of the encounter. Martin laughed, a ragged sound bordering on hysteria. Of course it did. Of course it malfunctioned. And the body cam? Officer Cole forgot to activate it until after you were in cuffs and the drugs were found. Martin, they wiped it clean. It's their word against yours. Elena didn't tell him the other things she found. She had her paralegal dig into Officer Derek Cole's service record. It was a graveyard of civil rights complaints. Excessive force, racial profiling, illegal searches. 74 complaints in 8 years, and every single one of them had been dismissed. When she cross-referenced the dismissals with the court docket, a sickening pattern emerged. 80% of the cases involving Officer Cole's arrests landed in Judge Lawrence Thorne's court. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a pipeline. Cole supplied the bodies, Thorne supplied the sentences, and somewhere along the line, money was changing hands. They were running a human trafficking ring under the guise of the justice system. "Listen to me, Martin," Elena said, trying to inject steel into her voice. "Thorne wants a quick conviction. He wants you scared. He wants you to take a plea deal tomorrow morning just to make it stop. Are you going to do that?" "No," Martin whispered. "I didn't do this. My mother. She worked 3 jobs so I wouldn't end up in a place like this. I won't plead guilty to their lies." "Good. Then we fight with what we have, which is the truth. Get some sleep." Elena hung up. She stared at the wall. They were going into a gunfight armed with a plastic spoon. Miles away, in a sterile hotel room, serving as a temporary FBI command post, Agent Sarah Miller was listening to a recording of that very phone call. "Thorne is accelerating the timeline," Agent David Ross said, pacing the room. 2 days for a felony trial. He's practically broadcasting the fix. "He's arrogant," Miller said, taking off her headphones. "He's been doing this for 20 years in Harris County, and nobody has ever touched him. He thinks he's God in that courtroom." On the desk between them were stacks of surveillance photos. Pictures of Officer Cole meeting with Prosecutor Vance in a strip club parking lot. Pictures of Vance handing a thick manila envelope to Judge Thorne's bailiff behind the courthouse. They had the pieces, but they didn't have the smoking gun, the direct link to Thorne himself. "We need him on record," Ross said. "We need Thorne to explicitly violate Hayes's constitutional rights in open court in a way that can't be attributed to mere incompetence." "He will," Miller said coldly. "Men like Thorne can't help themselves. When they feel challenged, they double down on the cruelty. Tomorrow, he's going to try to bury Martin Hayes. And we're going to let him dig the hole." Courtroom 4B felt different on the day of the trial. The air was thicker, hotter. The gallery was packed to capacity. Word had spread that the hangman had a big fish on the hook, a rich black man who needed to be taken down a peg. Martin was brought in wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. Thorne had denied Elena's motion to allow Martin to wear civilian clothes, citing security concerns. It was another tactic to prejudice the jury before a word was even spoken. "Look at him," the jumpsuit said. "He's already a convict." Martin sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped. He looked 10 years older. He scanned the crowd, his eyes landing briefly on the 2 agents in the back row. They were still there, watching. Judge Thorne entered, his black robe billowing around his massive frame. He didn't sit. He fell into his chair, glaring at the defense table. "Let's get this over with," Thorne grumbled into the microphone. Jury selection was a farce. Thorne took over the questioning, a highly unusual move. He dismissed any potential juror who expressed even a mild skepticism of police testimony. He dismissed a young black teacher because she wore a Black Lives Matter pin, calling it terrorist insignia in open court. By noon, they had a jury. 8 white men, 4 white women. Most were older, from the affluent suburbs outside the city loop. People who viewed men like Martin as an inherent threat to their property values. Prosecutor Vance gave his opening statement. It was smooth, rehearsed, and completely fabricated. He painted Officer Cole as a hero holding the line against chaos, and Martin as a violent drug trafficker hiding behind a corporate facade. When Elena stood up, Thorne immediately began shuffling papers, making a show of his boredom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena began, her voice shaking slightly, "the state wants you to believe a fairy tale. They want you to believe that a man at the pinnacle of his career, with everything to lose, decided to drive around with cocaine and fight a police officer. The truth is ugly. The truth is that my client was targeted because of the color of his skin and the car he drove. The truth is that the evidence was plan." "Bang! Objection!" Vance yelled, though he hadn't stood up. "Sustained!" Thorne roared, pointing a meaty finger at Elena. "Ms. Rosales, you will not use my courtroom to peddle conspiracy theories against our law enforcement. One more word about targeting, and I will declare a mistrial and hold you in contempt. Your Honor, it is central to our defense theory that—" "Your defense theory is irrelevant if it lacks evidence. Sit down." Martin put his head in his hands. It was hopeless. The state called its only witness, Officer Derek Cole. Cole walked to the stand with a swagger. In his dress uniform, polished and pressed, he looked like the picture of American virtue. Under Vance's gentle questioning, Cole recited the lies. "He was swerving, sir, crossing the double yellow line. When I approached, the smell of unburnt cannabis was overwhelming. I asked him to step out, and he became combative. He swung at me." "And then what happened, Officer Cole?" Vance asked tenderly. "I subdued him for my own safety. During a subsequent search of the vehicle, I discovered a bag containing a white, powdery substance under the driver's seat, where he had been reaching. Thank you, officer. Your witness?" Elena stood up. This was it. The only shot they had. "Officer Cole," Elena said, walking toward the stand. "You testified you smelled cannabis. Did you find any cannabis in the car?" Cole smirked. "No. We believe he may have tossed it before I approached." "You believe? But you didn't see it. You also testified my client swung at you. That is a felony assault. Why wasn't he charged with assault?" Vance stood up. "Objection? Irrelevant?" "Sustained," Thorne bored. "Stick to the drug charges, counselor." Elena grit her teeth. "Officer, isn't it true your dashcam system was working perfectly right up until you spotted Mr. Hayes's car?" "Like I put in my report," Cole said dryly. "It malfunctioned. Bad luck." "Bad luck," Elena repeated. She picked up a piece of paper. "I have here the maintenance logs for your cruiser, officer. Your camera system was serviced and certified fully operational just 3 days before this arrest." Cole blinked. For the first time, his composure cracked. He looked quickly at Prosecutor Vance, then up at Judge Thorne. "Machinery breaks, lady," Cole snapped. "And the body cam? You forgot to turn it on until after you allegedly found the drugs? In the heat of the moment, dealing with a violent suspect. Yes, I forgot." Elena leaned in on the podium. "Officer Cole, in your police report, you stated you found the drugs under the passenger seat. Just now, under oath, you told this jury you found them under the driver's seat. Which lie is it?" The courtroom went dead silent. Cole froze. He had slipped. The rehearsal hadn't covered that detail. I misspoke just now," Cole stammered. "It was the passenger seat." "So you lied under oath just 30 seconds ago." "Objection! Badgering the witness!" Vance screamed. Sustained! Thorne bellowed, his face turning purple. He hammered the gavel repeatedly. Ms. Rosales, step back. You are trying to trick this officer with semantics. Your Honor, it is a material contradiction in his testimony regarding the central piece of evidence, Elena cried out, pointing at Cole. He is lying to this court. That is enough. Thorne stood up, his chair screeching back. I've heard enough of these theatrics. The jury will disregard the defense attorney's last outburst. Officer Cole, step down. Does the state rest? We rest, Your Honor, Vance said quickly, looking relieved. Mr. Hayes, Thorne said, turning his baleful gaze on Martin. Your lawyer seems interested in fairy tales. Unless you have actual evidence to present, I suggest we move to closing arguments. Elena looked at Martin. Her eyes were filled with tears of frustration. They had caught the cop lying, and the judge had simply erased it from the record. They had nothing left. The defense rests, Your Honor, Elena whispered, defeated. In the back row, Agent Sarah Miller closed her notebook with a sharp snap. It was loud enough to make the person next to her jump. She looked at Agent Ross and gave a barely perceptible nod. They had heard enough too. The trap was primed. Now it was time to spring it. The jury was out for exactly 18 minutes. In a complex felony case involving drug possession and assaulting an officer, deliberations usually take hours, sometimes days. 18 minutes meant they hadn't deliberated at all. They had simply walked into the room, taken a poll, and walked back out. Martin sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Elena Rosales was staring at the table, her face a mask of stone. She knew what was coming. Every lawyer in the room knew. All rise, the bailiff droned. Judge Lawrence Thorne returned to the bench. He looked energized, almost giddy. He had a steak dinner scheduled for 7 p.m. with the warden of the private detention center that held the county's overflow inmates, a warden who paid Thorne a consulting fee for every head he sent their way. Thorne checked the clock. 4:45 p.m. Plenty of time to ruin this man's life and still make his reservation. Have you reached a verdict? Thorne asked, not even looking at the foreman. The foreman, a heavy-set man who had spent the entire trial glaring at Martin, stood up. We have, Your Honor. Read it. On the charge of possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute, we find the defendant, Martin Hayes, guilty. A gasp ripped through the gallery. Martin closed his eyes. He felt like he was falling. On the charge of resisting arrest, the foreman continued, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of assault on a police officer, we find the defendant guilty. Thorne smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the rictus grin of a shark biting into a seal. Thank you for your service to this community, he told the jury. You have done a difficult but necessary job today. He turned to Martin. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Martin Hayes, Thorne began, his voice dropping an octave for dramatic effect. You stand before me a convicted felon. You thought your money could buy you out of this. You thought your suit could hide your nature. But the law sees all. I am innocent, Martin said quietly. Silence! Thorne slammed his hand on the bench. You show no remorse, even now. That only proves you are beyond redemption. You are a cancer on this city, Mr. Hayes, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Your Honor, Elena stood up, desperate. We request a pre-sentencing investigation. We ask for a date to be set for sentencing, so we can gather character witnesses and— Denied, Thorne cut her off. I've heard all I need to hear. I see no reason to delay justice. I am ready to sentence the defendant now. Now, Elena cried. That is highly irregular. He has no prior record. The guidelines suggest probation or a minimum stay. "The guidelines," Thorne sneered, "are advisory. I am the judge, and I judge this man to be a menace." Thorne leaned forward, relishing the moment. This was the part he lived for. The power of God. "On the count of possession, I sentence you to 20 years in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. On the count of assault, 10 years. On the count of resisting, 5 years. The courtroom went dead silent. 35 years. It was a death sentence. "Sentences to run consecutively," Thorne added, delivering the final twist of the knife. "You will not be eligible for parole until you have served at least 25 years. You will leave prison an old man, Mr. Hayes, if you leave at all." "You can't do this," Martin shouted, standing up, tears finally streaming down his face. "I have a life. I built a company. I help people." "Bailiff, take him into custody," Thorne ordered, waving his hand as if swatting a fly. "Get him out of my sight." Officer Cole, standing by the wall, was grinning. He stepped forward, unhooking a pair of heavy transport chains from his belt. He was going to enjoy this. He was going to chain Martin Hayes up like an animal right in front of the judge. As Cole grabbed Martin's shoulder and spun him around, Martin looked up at the ceiling, praying for a miracle. He didn't know the miracle was already in the room. "Stop!" The word didn't come from Eleanor. It didn't come from Martin. It came from the back of the courtroom, booming with a command that froze everyone in place. Officer Cole paused, the handcuffs dangling inches from Martin's wrists. Judge Thorne looked up, annoyed. "Who dares interrupt my court?" Thorne bellowed. "Bailiff, arrest that man for contempt." Agent David Ross was walking down the center aisle. He didn't look like a spectator anymore. His stride was predatory. Behind him, Agent Sarah Miller was moving toward the court reporter, flashing a gold badge that caught the courtroom lights. "Sit down," Thorne screamed. "I said bailiff, seize him." The bailiff moved toward Ross. Ross didn't break stride. He held up a hand, palm out. "Federal agent, sit down, deputy, or you go down with the ship." The bailiff froze. The mention of federal sucked the air out of the room. Ross stopped at the gate, separating the gallery from the well of the court. He looked directly at Judge Thorne. "Judge Lawrence Thorne," Ross said, his voice calm and deadly loud. "I am Special Agent David Ross with the FBI's Public Integrity Task Force. Beside me is Special Agent Miller." Thorne's face went from red to a ghostly white in a split second. He tried to bluster through it. "I don't care who you are. You have no jurisdiction in my courtroom. This is a state matter. I am in the middle of a sentencing hearing." "The sentencing is over, Lawrence," Agent Miller said, from the side of the room. She wasn't using his title, and so is your career. "Get out!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking. "I will have you both disbarred. I will have you arrested." "No," Ross said, unbuttoning his jacket to reveal the sidearm on his hip. "You won't, because as of 10 minutes ago, a federal warrant was issued for your arrest." The courtroom erupted. Reporters who had been half asleep in the back row jumped up, phones recording. Elena Rosales looked from the agents to Martin, her mouth open. "Arrest?" Thorne sputtered. "For what? Being a tough judge? That's not a crime." "For racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, and 18 counts of obstruction of justice," Ross recited, stepping through the gate. "Lies!" Thorne yelled. "You have no proof." "Proof?" Miller laughed darkly. She walked over to the defense table and plugged a small flash drive into the court's presentation laptop. "Let's talk about proof. Let's talk about the Mercedes-Benz S-Class." Officer Cole, who had been slowly backing away toward the side exit, froze. "Officer Cole," Miller said, looking at him, "you're a smart guy. You wiped the body cam. You crashed the cruiser's dash cam. But you made one mistake. You didn't know cars have evolved." Miller hit a key on the laptop. The large projection screen behind the judge, usually used to display evidence against defendants, flickered to life. A high-definition video appeared. It was a wide-angle view from the dashboard of Martin's car. The 2024 S-Class, Miller narrated, has a built-in 360-degree security system called Guard 360. It records to a cloud server anytime the vehicle is jostled or detects a collision event. It also records audio inside the cabin. On the screen, the courtroom watched the traffic stop unfold in crisp 4K resolution. They saw Martin's car come to a complete, gentle stop. They saw Officer Cole approach aggressively. They heard the audio perfectly. Audio. "Whose car is this? You expect me to believe a guy like you owns a ride like this?" "Racially motivated bias," Miller noted. Then on the screen, the moment of truth. Cole yanked Martin out of the car. Martin did not swing. Martin didn't resist. He was thrown to the ground. And then the courtroom gasped in unison. On the video, while Martin was pinned on the ground outside, the camera inside the car captured Officer Cole leaning into the open window. He reached into his own pocket, not the car, and pulled out a small plastic baggie. He checked to make sure no one was watching and shoved it under the passenger seat. "There it is," Ross said, pointing at the screen. "Fabrication of evidence. A federal crime." Officer Cole bolted. He shoved the bailiff aside and sprinted for the side door. "Stark, now!" Ross yelled into his earpiece. The side door flew open, and a team of FBI tactical agents in full body armor burst in. Cole ran straight into a riot shield. He was tackled instantly, his face pressed against the same floor where he had hoped to see Martin dragged away. Judge Thorne sat paralyzed on his bench. His hands were shaking so hard the gavel rolled off the desk and clattered onto the floor. But that's just the cop," Thorne stammered, sweat pouring down his face. "I didn't know. I'm a victim here too. He misled the court." "Nice try, Lawrence," Ross said. He walked up the steps to the bench. No one stopped him. "But we have the wiretaps." "Wiretaps?" Thorne squeaked. "We've been up on your phone for 6 months, Ross said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "We heard you call Warden Higgins last night. We heard you ask, and I quote, 'I've got a rich one coming in tomorrow. Hayes, if I give him 20 years, what's the bonus structure looking like for Q4? The gasp from the gallery was replaced by a roar of anger. People stood up. "Monster!" someone shouted. "We also heard you talking to Prosecutor Vance," Ross continued, pointing at the weaselly prosecutor who was currently trying to hide under his table. "You told him, make sure the jury is white, and make sure Cole keeps his mouth shut about the camera. You knew, Lawrence. You orchestrated the whole thing." Ross pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Not the cheap ones. Heavy, federal steel. "Judge Lawrence Thorne," Ross said. "Stand up." Thorne didn't move. He looked like a deflated balloon. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified, pathetic reality of a bully who has finally met a bigger stick. "I said, stand up." Ross grabbed Thorne by the collar of his robe and hauled the massive man to his feet. Thorne began to cry, huge, heaving sobs. "Please," he whimpered. "I'm a judge. You can't do this here, not in front of them." "You didn't mind destroying his life in front of them," Ross said, gesturing to Martin. "Turn around." Ross spun the judge around. He cuffed his hands behind his back, over the black robes. "Get him out of here," Ross signaled to the tactical team. 2 agents grabbed Thorne by the arms and began marching him down the steps of the bench, the same steps he had looked down from for 20 years. As they dragged him past the defense table, Thorne locked eyes with Martin. Thorne's eyes begged for mercy. Martin just looked at him, his expression calm, his dignity intact. "Ms. Rosales," Agent Miller said, walking over to the defense table. The United States Attorney has already filed a motion to vacate the verdict and dismiss all charges with prejudice. Your client is free to go." Elena burst into tears. She grabbed Martin and hugged him. Martin didn't cry. He watched Officer Cole being dragged out one door and Judge Thorne being dragged out the other. But the story wasn't over. The karma was just beginning. Because federal prison is a very different place for a judge than for anyone else. And Martin Hayes had one more move to make. The immediate aftermath of the arrest in Courtroom 4B was not silence. It was a roar that shook the foundations of the Harris County justice system. As FBI tactical teams secured the building, seizing servers, cell phones, and filing cabinets, two very different processions were taking place. Out the back service entrance, usually reserved for the trash and the condemned, Judge Lawrence Thorne was being shoved into the back of an unmarked federal SUV. His hands were cuffed so tightly behind his back that his circulation was cutting off, but no one cared about his comfort. He was hyperventilating, his face pressed against the tinted glass, watching his empire recede into the distance. For 20 years, he had left this building in a chauffeur-driven town car, heading to steakhouses and country clubs. Today, he was heading to the Federal Detention Center, a concrete box in the humid heart of Houston. Out the front doors, however, it was a different scene. Martin Hayes stepped into the late afternoon sun, the golden light hitting his face like a benediction. He took a deep breath, the first breath of true freedom he had taken in days. Next to him stood Elena Rosales, her mascara slightly running from tears of relief, and Agents Ross and Miller, the silent guardians who had sprung the trap. A phalanx of news cameras was waiting. The story had leaked instantly. Judge Thorne arrested in courtroom sting. It was the kind of headline that stopped traffic. "Mr. Hayes," a reporter from Channel 11 shouted, thrusting a microphone forward. "You were facing 35 years in prison just an hour ago. Now the judge who sentenced you is in handcuffs. What is going through your mind?" Martin adjusted his cuffs. He looked calm, almost regal. He didn't scream or cheer. He looked directly into the camera lens. "Today the system tried to eat me alive," Martin said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "It thought I was food. It thought I was just another number to be processed for profit. But they forgot one thing. Even a beast will choke if the bone is too hard. Judge Thorne isn't a judge anymore. He's a criminal. And I'm going home to my daughter." While Martin was hugging his family, Lawrence Thorne was experiencing the first circle of his personal hell. The Federal Detention Center, FDC, does not care about your resume. Thorne was brought into the intake processing area, a large, sterile room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and old fare. He was unchained from the transport agents and handed over to the corrections officers. "Strip!" a guard barked. He was a young man, stone-faced, snapping a pair of blue latex gloves. "Do you know who I am?" Thorne sputtered, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. "I am Judge Lawrence Thorne. I play golf with the governor. I demand to see the warden immediately." The guard didn't even blink. "Warden Higgins was arrested 40 minutes ago for wire fraud and conspiracy, inmate. He's in a holding cell 3 floors down. Now strip, or we will strip you." The reality hit Thorne like a physical blow. The warden, his co-conspirator, his drinking buddy, was gone. The shield was gone. Thorne, a man who had mocked defendants for their appearance, was forced to undress under the harsh fluorescent lights. He stood naked, shivering, his pale, doughy flesh exposed. He was subjected to a cavity search, the ultimate invasion of privacy, a humiliation he had ordered for thousands of men without a second thought. Now, he was the one bent over, coughing on command. He was tossed a jumpsuit. It wasn't the pressed uniform of an officer. It was orange. The fabric was coarse, smelling faintly of the previous wearer's sweat. It was 2 sizes too small, tight around his gut. "Inmate 7440, the guard said, handing him a thin, scratchy blanket. "Welcome to the terrifying reality you helped build." Thorne was placed in a segregation cell for his protection, but the isolation was worse than the general population. It was a 6-by-8-foot box, no window, 1 steel toilet, 1 concrete slab. That night, as the lights buzzed overhead, Thorne curled into a ball. He reached for his phone to call his broker, to move his money, to fix this, then realized his pockets were empty. He reached for his gavel and realized his hand was empty. He wept, a guttural, ugly sound, as the realization set in. The hangman has been hung. Over the next 6 months, the Department of Justice dismantled Thorne's life with surgical precision. Agent David Ross led the investigation. They didn't just find a few bribes, they found a sophisticated criminal enterprise. Thorne had been receiving kickbacks from the private prison industry for every year of sentencing he handed down. He had been shorting stocks of companies owned by defendants he was about to rule against. But the hardest blow came from his friends. Prosecutor Vance, the weaselly man who had prosecuted Martin, flipped on Thorne in less than 24 hours to save his own skin. He gave the feds everything: the secret ledgers, the burner phones, the meeting locations. Officer Derek Cole, facing 20 years, testified that Thorne explicitly instructed him to target expensive cars driven by minorities to generate revenue for the court through asset forfeiture. Thorne watched from his cell as his legal team abandoned him. His assets were frozen. His bank accounts in the Caymans were seized by international warrant. His mansion in River Oaks was foreclosed upon. His wife filed for divorce and took the kids to Aspen, issuing a statement that she was unaware of her husband's activities. He was alone, penniless, defenseless. The trial of United States versus Lawrence Thorne was the most watched legal event in Texas history. It was moved to the federal courthouse in Austin to ensure a fair jury, though finding anyone who didn't hate Thorne was nearly impossible. Presiding over the case was Judge Patricia Halloway. She was a legend on the federal bench, a woman known for her intellect and her absolute intolerance for corruption. She was everything Thorne pretended to be. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. But this wasn't the usual crowd. The gallery was filled with the Thorne survivors, men and women, mostly black and Latino, whom Thorne had wrongfully imprisoned over 2 decades. They sat in silence, wearing T-shirts that read, "Justice Finally." Martin Hayes sat in the front row. He looked at Thorne, who was slumped at the defense table. Thorne looked 20 years older. His hair had fallen out in clumps from stress. He had lost 50 pounds from the prison food. He looked like a ghost. Judge Halloway adjusted her glasses and looked down at the disgraced man. "Lawrence Thorne," she began, her voice quiet but filling the room. "You sat on a bench that represents the highest ideal of our society, equal justice under the law. You took that ideal and you sold it. You turned this court into a marketplace where human years were the currency." Thorne stood up, his legs shaking. "Your Honor, I was a victim of the culture. I ask for mercy." "Mercy?" Halloway's eyes flashed. "You ask for what you never gave. You sentenced Martin Hayes to 35 years for a crime you knew he didn't commit. You tried to bury a good man to buy a vacation home." She opened the file in front of her. "Under the RICO Act and federal sentencing guidelines, given the severity of the civil rights violations and the sheer volume of victims, I have very little discretion. Nor do I want any. Lawrence Thorne, I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A gasp went through the room, not of shock, but of pure release. People hugged each other. Some wept. Furthermore, Halloway continued, twisting the knife, I am ordering immediate restitution. Every dollar you have, every property, every hidden account the FBI has uncovered, it is all forfeited. It will go into a fund to compensate the victims of your court. You leave this life with nothing. But the universe wasn't done with Lawrence Thorne yet. There is a specific irony to the American prison system. Years prior, as a tough-on-crime judge, Thorne had heavily lobbied the state legislature to cut funding for special protective custody units. He had argued in op-eds that criminals don't deserve hotels and that protective custody was a waste of taxpayer money. His lobbying had worked. The budget was slashed. Now, as a federal inmate, that policy came back to haunt him. Because of the overcrowding in the protective units, overcrowding caused by the very laws Thorne enforced, the Bureau of Prisons had no choice. After 6 months in isolation, Thorne was deemed low risk enough to be moved to a general population unit at a medium security facility in Beaumont, Texas. He was walked onto the block during recreation hour. The noise in the yard stopped. Hundreds of men stopped lifting weights, stopped playing basketball, and turned to look. They didn't see an old man. They saw the hangman. They saw the man who had put half of their cousins, brothers, and fathers away. Thorne clutched his laundry bag, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked for a guard, but the guard was at the far end of the yard, looking at his phone. A shadow fell over Thorne. He looked up. Standing there was a massive inmate, scarred and tattooed. Thorne recognized him. It was the very first man Thorne had ever sentenced, 20 years ago. A man who had claimed innocence, whose evidence Thorne had suppressed. "Hello, Judge," the man said, smiling. It wasn't a nice smile. Court is now in session. Thorne wasn't killed. That would have been too easy. He was beaten. Badly. He spent 3 months in the infirmary, drinking meals through a straw. When he recovered, he was sent back to the block. He spent the rest of his life in a state of perpetual terror, looking over his shoulder, living in the exact nightmare he had created for others. He died 9 years later, alone, unmourned, his name becoming a synonym for corruption. While Thorne rotted, Martin Hayes flourished. The civil settlement from the county was historic, $25 million. Martin didn't buy a yacht. He didn't retire. He resigned from Apex Logistics and founded the Hayes Justice Initiative. He hired Elena Rosales as his chief legal officer. Together, they used the settlement money to fund a team of 20 lawyers who did nothing but audit the old cases of Judge Thorne and Officer Cole. 5 years later, Martin stood on the steps of that same courthouse. Behind him stood 412 men and women. They were fathers, mothers, sons and daughters. They were people who had been exonerated because of Martin's work. 412 lives saved from the void. Martin held his daughter's hand. She was older now, understanding what her father had done. "Daddy," she asked, looking at the crowd cheering for him. "Did you win?" Martin looked at the faces of the families reunited. He looked at the sky, clear and blue. "We didn't just win, baby," Martin said softly. "We changed the game." And that is the incredible, true-to-life story of how one man's arrogance became his own undoing. Judge Thorne thought he was untouchable. He thought Martin Hayes was just another statistic. But he forgot the most important rule of the universe. What goes around, comes around. And sometimes it comes around with a federal badge and a 4K camera. Martin Hayes didn't just win his freedom. He used his victory to free hundreds of others. It's a reminder that even when the system is broken, the truth is a force that cannot be buried forever. If you were in Martin's shoes, and you were offered a plea deal to do 2 years in prison or risk 35 years at trial, would you have taken the deal? Or would you have fought like he did? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. We have a crazy mafia romance story coming up next week that you do not want to miss. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.